How's everybody doing? We're going to start talking about sin. What is it? Does it really exist? Is it just a construct of our imagination? Is it something we created? Or is there an actual code or rules that are written in stone by the Almighty King? And so we're going to talk about that. What is sin? What is the nature of sin? And Tom's going to go ahead and begin to elaborate on it. Here we go.
So, based on what we were talking about last recording, we kind of left it open with, what is sin and how do we define it? What does it mean to sin, etc. So, based on that, what I researched and came up with was pretty interesting. To start off, sin is always and ultimately related to God. Okay, so if you don't believe in God, then sin does not exist to you. The word sin, it is completely related to God. Okay, so you got to have that in mind. Sin is moral evil as opposed to natural evil. So moral evil is rebellion against God and is what brought natural evil into the world. Natural evil would be like cancer, okay, or death, as opposed to moral evil, which opposes God's law. Sin is breaking God's law. Sin is doing evil. It's disobedience. It's transgression, iniquity, lawlessness. It's been referred to as trespass in the Bible, ungodliness, unrighteousness, unholy, and wickedness. So, given those definitions or parameters, what does it mean to sin? What are your initial thoughts hearing that?
Well, the way I understand it is that when you sin, now here's the thing, you think or do something or do something that is simply just not in the line of God's will for us, or God's will, really. So I can see what you're saying. Sin only exists to those who believe in God.
Yeah.
And you're probably going to answer this later, but the question is, say you have a person who is a believer in God and then an atheist, somebody who just simply does not believe in any higher power or creator, just that the world is a result of organisms mutating and that's it. Microorganisms, single cell organisms, whatever, over the course of time. So are the ramifications the same for the atheist as they are for the believer? And so there's that, and I assume you're going to talk about that. So for me, it is anything you do or think, say, that goes against God's will. That's what I think sin is.
Yeah. Well, to piggyback off that, and it goes without saying that I'm speaking from my own opinion, from what I know, right? So I'm not speaking as a matter of fact, but I look at sin like this: that God had an original plan with his creation, and it was for us to never die physically and to live in perfect harmony with one another. But because of the original sin, that brought natural evil into the world. So that brought death into the world, and then disease and the ramifications of the sin. Okay? And the way I look at sin is this: sin is what God knows will hurt us emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Okay, so He's not giving us these guidelines or laws or regulations to constrain us, or to just because He's a mean God, or because He wants to be a bully, or a dictator or whatever. He's not just making up these laws, if you will, for His benefit. He's telling us, hey, I don't want you to sleep with other girls if you're married, multiple girls if you're married. I want you to be with one person, and it's a sin to deviate from that. I'm not telling you that because it hurts me. It's going to hurt you. And so I'm telling you these things because they're good for you. If you obey these laws and regulations in your life, you will see that it will do well for you. And so if that's true, then the sins affect the atheist as much as they affect the believer, because these aren't subjective, right? They don't just apply to believers. If you don't believe, just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Like, you could tell me, hey, I've got something in my hand right now. My hand's covered. You can't see it. I have something in my hand. And if I tell you, no, you don't, I saw your hand, 2 seconds ago, and there was nothing in it. You don't have anything in your hand. And I put all my faith in that belief. And I say, as a matter of fact, like, no, I have proof. I saw your hand. You don't have it. It doesn't change the fact that you do have something in your hand. Okay? So it doesn't matter what you believe if it's contrary to the truth. It doesn't change the truth. So sin affects the atheist just as much as it affects the believer, because it will hurt you, morally, physically, spiritually, if you have other spiritual beliefs, with your conscience and whatever, not having that peace in your heart, staying up late at night because you're miserable or whatever, or you're you feel guilty for what you've done, even though you don't believe in a God. So I think it has the same effect, or it does have the same effect for all humanity. And I think the biggest thing to point out is that these rules or laws or regulations that God has commanded us not to do, they're not for Him, they're for us. They're for our own benefit. And it's the same way as when we tell our kids not to touch the stove, not to run across the street without looking, not to, disappear from us when we're at the store, or go up to strangers and, hop in their car. It's like we tell our kids to do these things because we know that they're good for them. And we know that if they disobey us, that it will ultimately hurt them, and it's not to say that it doesn't hurt God, because, it does in some way, shape, or form hurt God when we sin against Him, when we disobey Him. But it's not like God is trying to make us have boring lives, or not have fun, like if, for example, if we enjoy getting drunk and then it causes us to drive home intoxicated, right? Like that could end up in a very bad scenario. So to not get drunk and put yourself in that position is a good thing. But if you like doing that and you disobey that, you are going to suffer the consequences of it.
I was thinking about if the consequences are the same for the unbeliever as they are for the believer, then are the benefits the same as well?
I would say to some extent, yeah. I mean,
What's the extent?
well, maybe in all ways, shape, or form. So the way that salvation works, right? Like, salvation is not about not sinning. It's about being in a relationship with your maker, with your creator. So people who think if they don't break the law or if they don't sin, even if they're atheists, then they're going to be good and go to heaven. That's not the case. Like, heaven is eternity with God is not about not sinning. It's about having a relationship with God, Jesus, and accepting him as your Lord, Savior, and Creator. And so the benefits of not sinning here on earth are the same for all. I would say that they're the same for all of humanity. Somebody that lives by a moral and ethical code that aligns with biblical teachings and principles is going to reap those benefits. If somebody does, like I just said, obeys the law and has moral and ethical codes, they don't lie, they don't cheat, they don't steal, they're not greedy, they're not drunkards, etc. You just keep on going down the line of what sin is. That is going to benefit them just as much as it will benefit the believer, because those laws are for all of humanity, and they have, in my opinion, they have the same benefit. But I think the biggest benefit in life is knowing God and having a purpose, and being able to tap into those resources and his and that relationship with him. So, like one thing, just to maybe this doesn't tie in directly with the sin issue that is at hand, but one biblical principle is that you may have heard it said that the rain falls on the just and unjust alike.
Yeah.
Right. So like, if like these laws that are in place, they apply to sinners or unbelievers and believers. And so if you have a good work ethic and you have a ethical code and whatnot, you can prosper and do well in your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
That's like my. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's it on that. As far as the laws of God, the blessings of life here on earth,
Yeah.
can apply to both believers and unbelievers.
Yeah, one thing that I always find myself in a position of is to kind of not side, but to really think for not only the believer side, but also versus the unbeliever side. And it's funny how, like right now, our conversation seems to be very God or not God, when previously it was kind of just focusing on truth.
Yeah.
Because when you're in a group of people and everybody is talking about getting to the truth of things, then everybody's kind of even on an even playing field.
Mm-hmm.
And see, and that I can see why it's very unattractive to people who are not believer in a higher power, creator, etc. It's very off-putting because you immediately take the position of, hey, because you don't believe in this thing, unfortunately for you, you can't participate in this in the same way as the believer. And that could be that immediate conversation or just kind of like life in general. It's like, hey, man, you can, there's some lighter fluid on it. You can live this life and benefit from, you can have a good life by just obeying certain rules and conducting yourself in a way so that good is being attracted to you, and you're emitting goodness. Um, so there's that, but then there's um, that off-putting element where it's like, oh hey, by the way, since you're not a believer in God, you can only benefit so much, and then it's like, ooh, sorry for you, buddy. Um, and so I say that because I was talking about how I obviously slide, I think, deeply, or as deep as I can, into the the mentality and spirit of being a believer, and then also it's interesting to think as much as I could, as much as I can possibly, as the way an unbeliever would think. Somebody who's like, look, man, I'm going to conduct my life. Like, look, I know what's good and bad. Like, everybody grows up a little bit dumb, naive, and then you kind of become, your sharp edges become a little bit rounded, and you get better as you grow older because you have experience, you get wisdom. It's like, look, I'm gonna conduct my life so that I don't have to live miserably, and I know what things to do. Like, for example, I'll treat people well, I'll take care of people, I'll be a good steward of my things and other people's things. I'll be a good steward of relationships, and I'll just keep going down that path, and my life will be good. And that's it. Like, I'll have a family, I'll have friends, I'll grow my family, and then I'll grow old and die, and then the generations will carry on. And so that that story is like a nice story. It's like, hey man, you can live a miserable, wretched life if you do miserable things and wretched things. Or you can have the polar opposite of that. Do good things and your life will go down a nice trajectory, and then you can keep it going. And that's a nice picture, and then life will just continue to go. So, like, if you're trying to speak to somebody who's not a believer in God, in Jesus Christ, then it's easy for them to say, well, okay, that's fine, but I don't need that because this is the story. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of just my point is, if I guess, like, because you're talking about the whole rock or the thing in your hand thing. If it's there, it's there, right? But if I believe it's not there, then it's not there. But what if I just don't care if there's a rock in your hand?
Yeah.
So somebody will say, well, hey man, that's gonna suck for you because when you die and you get the judgment, like, it's gonna look pretty bad. Like, is that the final, like, trump on that debate? It's like, well, you better because you're gonna fry in hell or something like that. It's like, is that like the winning card? Is that what is that what we want the winning card to be? Is to,
No.
like, the last thing be like, okay, well, fear then, man. Like, fear then. Like, go live your good life and all this and all that, and yeah, you're a good person, but fear, man, because it's gonna come. It's gonna get you eventually. So, it's your call now, man. The truth's the truth. So, how do you approach that?
Well, it's yeah, that whole concept is really very interesting to me because I, much like you, always consider the unbeliever and their position. And the gospel is offensive in of itself. Okay? We don't have to make it offensive. We can be as kind and polite as we possibly can be, but when we present the gospel to somebody that doesn't believe, it in itself can be offensive. Because if somebody is dead set on atheism, there's no God, etc., and they believe it, like let's just say that they are the smartest scientist in the world, and they have all the proof that they could possibly need and want, that would, in their minds, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no God. And so it's naturally offensive to them, or it could be offensive to them, because you're saying, well, no, you're wrong. There is a God. And so my thing is, to your point, like, I don't want to offend people. I wish there was an unbeliever right here having a conversation with us, and give us his point of view or her point of view, because that whole argument, like what you said, is offensive. Like, okay, man, well, you should fear then, because you're going to burn in hell for eternity. No, that's not it. Like, it's the opposite. It's like, hey, listen, I'm not worried about you going to hell at all. Like, I'm good with where I have my beliefs, okay? Your beliefs don't affect mine. Like, I'm going to go and live this great life that I can live with the Maker in a relationship with Him, and I'm going to spend eternity with Him. And I don't know what that looks like, etc. But what I'm telling you is this, is that, man, you could be tapping into something so much greater than what you're living right now. Because when you have a relationship with the Creator, let's just say hypothetically, like if there's a non-believer listening right now, and they could do me a favor, and just for one moment, just take the possibility that there is a Creator, okay? And just say hypothetically, if there is a Creator of the universe, and we can know Him, right? And we can have a relationship with Him, and we can ask Him for things, and we can tap into His resources. That right there is like the angle that I take, is like, hey, I want you to have the best life you can. And I personally don't believe that you can have the best life that you can here on earth without having a relationship with a Maker. I'm not saying that you're not going to have a good life and then you're going to be miserable if you don't know God. There are plenty of people, millions and millions of people who have lived a great life and had many successes, financially, physically, and health, and with their kids, and relationships, and marriage, and social scenes, right? Just like very successful people on a bunch of different areas of life that will die happy, whatever, successful. But I just don't believe that they are going to be as happy as they could be with a relationship with the Creator. And in my own life, how that...
You mean like after they die? After they die, or
during
you mean
life.
like if you were to rewind their life,
Yeah,
and they would have had a relationship with God?
Yeah.
Then all right. So then what? Let's just say that person who you just described lived their life out, and then they died. Mm-hmm. Okay. like you said, good life, good family, intelligent. Maybe they're even an inventor. Maybe they did all kinds of stuff. It was a good life, man. And they die. Now let's rewind it. Let's rewind that life again, and now they believe in God.
What changes?
Can you articulate what would have been different?
So, yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is the peace and purpose that you get with a creator. Okay, and so
what would you assume that the atheist's purpose was?
oh,
Or like specifically like this imaginative person we're talking about, which seems like a very realistic person. What's their purpose? Like, what do you assume?
I mean, I don't think they can actually have one. If they don't believe in a creator.
But what if they're like, my purpose was to do good for humanity? Let's just say that, for kicks and giggles. And by the way, I'm just
Yeah.
playing this side.
No, I get it.
It's like, yeah, man. Look, Tom, and I'll just play that guy. Look, Tom, I lived life, and my purpose was I really genuinely cared for people. I wanted to see people happy. I wanted to eliminate misery as best as I could, and that's what I did. I got into medicine, and I invented things to make people's lives better, and that was my purpose, to try to smother the misery as much as I possibly could. It still exists. It's very hard, but that was one of my primary driving factors.
So what I would say is, unfortunately, because of our hypothetical situation, we can't argue, definitively how this person's life was on the day-to-day, right? Because success, how do you even measure success to each individual? It's different, right? And so we just painted a picture of somebody that lived a great life, but we didn't talk about any of the downfalls that this person had, right? Like,
I was a rapist killer.
has anybody lived a great life and not had major heartbreak or major bad days and bad months, etc.? And so that's where I think so I said that the relationship with Christ, the peace that God gives you, that only God can give you, and knowing that everything's going to be okay, and to be able to lean on Him in times of trouble and confusion and chaos in your life, to be able to have those storms in your life, bad circumstances, and to be unaffected by them for the most part, I think is something that is not realistic for the atheist, right? Like, you can sit here and hypothetically argue that all day, that this person didn't have any of those problems, or was never depressed, or was never sad, or whatever, and I can't argue that, right? Because it's a hypothetical person. But I would say that that's not the case. That everybody on this earth, because it's a fallen world and there's sin and there's evil, that we all have crappy lives for the most part, right? Like we have day-to-day struggles. We have major downfalls. We have major struggles. We have character defects that we don't like about ourselves, and the person, like for me, example, how I cope with that and get peace from God through those situations. I've always said, with my divorce, I don't think I could have gotten through that without God, right? And I get from the atheist point of view, that may sound like off-putting or superficial or whatever. But for me, like, I know my life before Christ, and I know how I dealt with things, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just telling you right now, and I get that I can't prove this because we'll never know. But I can tell you right now that I probably would have taken my own life if I didn't believe that I had a purpose, right? And so you could sit there and say, well, that's your own fault, man, because there are plenty of people that don't believe in God and have gone through those same struggles and didn't commit suicide. So, okay, great. Well, that's fine if that really happened. But for me, God is what got me through. And I can't trade, me personally, I can't supplement or trade having a purpose and value from my Creator for anything. No wealth or friendship or material possession will ever come close to that. And the reason I can say that with confidence is because I was broken down to nothing, right? Like, I mean, bare bones, like, lost everything for the most part, was miserable, abused drugs, and was reckless with my life and careless and immature and just stooped to all-time low. But what kept me from going too far to where there's no return was having a relationship with Christ and knowing that I had a purpose and that I was created by Him with value. And so that right there, like, that experience that I have on a day-to-day with Him, with God, is more valuable to me than anything else. Mm-hmm. And so to somebody that lives a great life and doesn't have that, they'll never know. And it like I said this a couple episodes ago, but you ask any parent, any good parent, right? Because there are parents out there that have kids that are just horrible parents, like don't love their kids, neglect them, murder them, drown them, right? Like, but I'm talking about a good parent that loves their children. You ask any good parent if they knew what love was before they had a kid, and they will say no. Like, the love that I experienced when I had a kid is leagues beyond what I felt or thought love was before I had a kid. And I can say that, but the person that doesn't have a kid cannot relate to that. They cannot fully understand that. They can say, okay, I believe you, right? And that's great, but the love I have for my wife is strong enough for me. It's great, man. Like, I'm telling you, man, my relationship with my wife or my husband is so spectacular. So this love that you're talking about for a kid, like, that's fine, but this is enough to sustain me, whatever. But I'll tell you what, if they were on the other side of the tracks, the other side of the fence, they would sit there and say the same exact thing that I'm saying. And
so it's almost like a ignorance is bliss type of thing. Because I remember a long time ago, your brother, when he went on that trip across the country, he would communicate pretty much every day, give me a call, and one thing that he said was he came across a person who he went to a bike shop to fix a tire on his bike or something. Mm-hmm. And the bicycle owner was like, look, man, this is, I don't know, 2 weeks into his trip or something, or even a month. And the bike guy's like, look, dude, you are riding the completely wrong bicycle for this, what you're doing. Like, you need a touring bike. You have something totally wrong. He's like, this bike over here that I have is $3,000, and it is absolutely perfect for what you want. He's like, go ahead and give it a ride. And your brother was like, no, I'm not going to ride it. Because if I ride it, I'll know how much better it is than the bike I have. So it will make my trip miserable because I'll always be thinking about how much better it could be.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, I'm just gonna keep enduring with my bike. And I thought that was pretty brilliant and very disciplined on your brother's part. And so he didn't ride it, and he ended up riding the bike for another who knows how many miles, and then eventually the family gifted him with the bike. But so that's a little different because that's knowing that something could be better and rejecting it versus kind of just never really knowing anyway, but not missing out because, well, it's like anything. It's like, hey, you can be driving a better car that rides smoother and has better suspension, or you can be living in a slightly bigger or more efficient house or more aesthetically designed or something or whatever. You can do that with everything: shoes, clothes, every little thing. And but it's like, gosh, I could always want more or always desire more, or always think that it could be better. But we all know that. But I mean, it's a lot different when you're talking about love. But if somebody's life just happens to be going down this course, it's like, look, this person had 9 kids and you only had 1. You'll never know what it's like to have 8 more kids. It's like, well, what am I going to do about it? So I guess that's that point.
But yeah, I mean, I think the original thought of that was that a relationship with God from the other side may look foolish, right? And you can sit there and argue from your side because you have a limited perspective. And that's why...
Or just not argue, though.
Sure.
Like, well, I don't ever want to enter an arena where I need to argue that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't want to argue. I would never want to argue with somebody either to try to convince them that there is a God.
Because then you just become the finger pointer. Like, hey, man, you're not living your life like me.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
Oh, gee, shit, So, I feel like people's path. It's like you can take a big giant ball of marbles, just spill them across a big giant floor that's thousands of square feet. Just throw it all over there. It's like this marble's going to go this way, this one's going to go this way, all because of some cause. That's the effect. All these marbles are just going everywhere, and each marble's like, I'm just going this way because that's just the way I'm going, man. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not way over there because that's just how things happened. And so that's like, it's like life. Like, people are just the marbles, and there you go. Like, go live your life. It's like, well, you were born over there to that family, and I was born over here to this family, and gosh, but I can only think about that so long because I gotta just live this path. And I feel like people's path, not every path has to go the same way. Eventually people start to, it seems to me like there's this force. I mean, of course, I believe in God, but I'm trying to be like generalized here. If there's this force for the believer and unbeliever that kind of like wants to keep you in line, like kind of, it's like when you're guiding, like if you had a big giant ball and you're rolling it down like a path, and you just kind of need to tap it on its side here and there just so it kind of stays in that line. Otherwise, it's going to go way off. And so I feel like even to the unbeliever, like the guy we were talking about earlier, it's like even though they're not a believer, but they're still living and like they're still kind of being padded, even if they're not if they don't confess God, they're still kind of padded to that road. But at the same time, there are people out there who, they go way off, and maybe even people who, I mean, look, I've witnessed people who confess God, and they're like, yeah, I'm a believer, and then next thing you know, you find out, oh yeah, they're still doing drugs, and yeah, they went to jail for 5 years. It's like, geez, what the heck, man? It's like, I thought you were a believer. It's like, well, I really, I tried to believe, but I guess I didn't believe good enough.
Well, that point right there, like I'm not sure where you were going with that at the end point, but
I guess, I guess the whole point of me, like speaking from this side, is I always wonder what like how God views everybody. You know, it's like man, I wonder how hard God is to the person who doesn't believe. Because there's people out there we're discussing this person who is still leading a good life. Like they're okay. They have a position in the community. They have a family, and they're caring, and they're a provider, and so on and so forth. And so, you just think about that stuff. At least I do. And then you see somebody who's like, oh no, I'm a believer, and I go to church, and it's just like, yeah, but you just got your third disease, man. Like they're gonna have to pluck your eye out now because now you have eye disease, eye cancer or whatever. So, I wonder what I guess now I didn't really realize I was getting to this, but I guess it's like, what does it really mean? Like, how do you really believe? Is it just confessing with your lips and words, or is it like something deeper that isn't words? So like that I just kind of arrived at that point, but that's interesting too, because I mean I'm
well,
sure people who confess and
yeah. Okay, so again, like, and this is what I was gonna say when I stopped you just a minute ago, is that believing in Christ is not the same thing as obeying his commands. Like, they should, um, the way I look at it is
is one better than the other.
obeying his commands is a byproduct of believing. Like you believe
Yeah.
in Christ, and because you believe, then you start changing your behavior,
Right.
or your
Yeah.
actions, because you, not because you want to necessarily, right? Like, for example, if I have if I'm addicted to a drug, okay, and science says it's bad, right? Like,
Yeah.
science will say that it is bad to be addicted to that drug.
Right.
But there's no moral consequence. I don't believe in God, whatever. I'm just going to keep doing it because what's the point? Who cares? I'm going to die anyway. Then I believe in God, and I realize that, oh my gosh, I'm harming my body, and I'm not living to my full potential, and there's so much more for me, and I'm really doing this drug anyway to cope with life, because life sucks. And so now I believe in God. I've changed my perspective. I have purpose. And because of that, I'm going to try my hardest to quit doing these drugs. Now I have a reason to quit other than science, and a motivation and willpower and a helper, right? And so, so then, you see those changes. But there are some times where you can believe in God, even in our own lives, right? We believe in God, but we still do things that we know we shouldn't do. And so it's like, maybe this is a bad analogy, but you believe that if you speed and a cop clocks you, you will get a ticket. But do you still speed? Well, I mean, I do, right? Do I, when I speed, do I think that those laws don't apply to me? No. I know that they apply. I know that if a cop sees me when I'm speeding, that it's illegal and I'm going to get a ticket. But sometimes I'll do it anyway. So it doesn't change my belief in the principle, right? It's just that, so then you couple belief with respect or reverence, okay?
So you speed because you're probably thinking, A, I'm not going to get caught, or
Yeah.
B, if I do, the ramifications won't be that severe.
Yeah.
I'll get a little ticket, I'll pay it, it'll be cool.
Yeah.
So it's like you're willing to break the rule because you can handle the consequence.
Well, you think so that's I mean you
Just
think
pertain to speeding.
yeah, you think, right, that the you think that the immediate pleasure is worth the potential harm, right? Because it's potential. You don't know if you're gonna get it. So
Risking it.
yeah, you're risking it, and you think, but then you get the speeding ticket, and what do you say? Oh my gosh, man, I wish I wouldn't have been speeding. Like, dude, if I would have just not sped that time, I wouldn't have gotten that ticket. And so then in hindsight, you're like, yeah, I wish I wouldn't have sped. Okay, so you can only say that in hindsight. So, but I think the reality of it is that you do say that to yourself. You say, okay, there's a consequence, I'm going to do it. But really, what's the driving factor is you don't think you're going to get caught.
Yeah.
You don't think that it's gonna, that you're gonna pay that penalty, and that's,
Or the penalty just isn't that big of a deal.
but yeah,
You can be like, and you can just kind of translate that to, hey man, I'm going to just say, screw it and just go sleep with the secretary, even though I'm married. It's like, yeah, it'll suck if I get caught, but it's not going to be like that big of a deal or I'm going to fry in hell for all eternity. I mean, look, me and my wife kind of been having a crappy relationship for the past 10 years. I think it's okay. I think it's time for her to kind of end it anyway. And so I'm good. So you justify it, right?
Yeah.
You justify it. It's like driving. Hey man, if I get pulled over, yeah, okay, I'll get a little ticket. Maybe I'll get a point on my license if that's how some states do it. But it'll be okay. It's
Yeah.
kind of worth it right now because I really don't feel like it's gonna be that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. So same thing. So it's like, you say you justify it, but
the point is that it doesn't take away your belief that something,
yeah, and that's your point, right?
yeah. And so,
belief would be a very good thing to talk about. Like there's somebody wrote a book called The Power of Belief. And so that's very interesting because it can be applicable to a lot of different things. Like, I believe that I deserve this job or something, or I believe I deserve a great relationship. So it's like, okay, the power of belief. It's the reason why, and this is like kind of a new agey thing where it's like, the reason why things aren't happening in your life the way you want them is because you don't believe. And maybe you don't believe hard enough because maybe you really believe that you're not deserving of this thing. And so what they try to do now, what the system's trying to do is say, hey, master how to believe. Because once you master belief, then you can just apply it to a lot of things. And then you'll start to get the things you want, or life will start to unfold in the way you want it to.
So okay, that thought process is so powerful, because when I said that the rain falls on the just and unjust alike, if you take that and apply it to certain aspects of life, what it's saying is that God's laws, okay, they apply to believers and unbelievers. So, let's just say the law of gravity. The law of gravity applies to everybody.
Whether you believe it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting about that is in my belief, any new age or any type of mind tricks or science-y things like that have proven true are God's original concepts anyway.
Right, yeah.
And so you talk about that, man, and I believe that. I think there's so much truth in that because of faith. Like in James, James 1, it says, And if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all generously without finding fault. But when he asks, do not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the seas tossed to and fro. And that person should not expect anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then another verse says, it is impossible to please God without faith.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
and Jesus said, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can move this mountain. And so if you study faith in of itself, man, so like think about that. Faith, man, that's a concept, like God's laws. Those principles apply in secularism, right? So like the power of speaking good things in your life, and let's just say that you don't believe in God, but like you believe in the universe as some way of communicating, and so you speak to the universe like, I'm going to will this into existence. Yeah. I'm going to manifest this, right? And you speak it into your life. I think that those are invisible laws and principles that God has set up.
Yeah.
And that he wants us to use those and for him.
Yeah.
Ultimately. Yeah, exactly. And he knows what's best for us, so he wants us to tap into his resources and use those gifts and stuff for him. And we don't have to. Like we can use those apart from God, and again, like the blessings of God, like the sun, a nice sunny day blesses the unbeliever and the believer, right? If there are two farmers sitting on land and they're neighbors, and one's a godly man and one's an atheist, and they both need rain for their crops, and one prays for rain and it falls on the lands, the unbeliever gets that rain too, right? And so these invisible principles that God has set up, these laws, science thinks that that they operate without God because there is no God. But I would say, because of my belief, that God is the one that orchestrated those things. And once you start tapping into them, they're powerful, man. I mean, you and I were just talking about manifesting things and how do you do that and what's that all about. And I have gone through a couple experiences in the last week where I have manifested in my own mind. I've manifested two things that are like mind blowing, and they happen, and I sit there and I say, okay, did my belief in these things happening cause them to happen, or is it coincidence? Where's God's involvement in that? Was it lucky? And I just believed. Yeah. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, I just believed, man. I was just like, this is gonna happen, and man, I think it's so powerful. So like, I don't know. I think a belief is a great topic.
Yeah, that's something that we could definitely spend some time talking about. But yeah, like there's the whole movement, look, here's the thing, man. The law of attraction and all that stuff, like it got kind of popular in the past, 10, 15 years, whatever. But here's the truth. It's always been around. It's always been a law. It's not like it's like, oh, we just figured this out. I mean, there's people of ancient past who, in their terms and in their language and how they articulate, are essentially talking about the same exact thing, like receiving from the universe, believing and all that stuff. And then that documentary came out some years ago. It's like, look, it's your subconscious programming. If you could want something, but you don't get what you want, you get what you really believe you're gonna get, and then there's all that stuff. And so now there's this whole thing around it where it's like, well, yeah, okay, that's life, man. like we found the secret, and it's like cool. So once you've mastered it, you can kind of just sit around and manifest, not sit around with that work, but just kind of like treat the world as just this place where you get everything you want. Like how cool is that? It's like, man, that's a pretty like superficial world life. If it's all you're doing is sitting around to all you're doing is just constantly receiving what you want. What that would get boring pretty fast, I would assume. So the way I see it, it's like, man, there the whole point of being here is to have faith in God, like to just focus on God and glorify God, and all that other stuff, the law of attraction and all this stuff. You know, it's there's a great quote. I forget who said it, but it's don't get too preoccupied with don't become too preoccupied with truths that are merely correct. I love it. I wrote that down and I repeat it all the time. Don't become too preoccupied with truths that are merely correct. It's kind of like the same thing with the law of attraction, believing and receiving. That's just a little truth. You don't have to be so preoccupied with it. Like, okay, now I'm gonna mold my whole life around this one little
Yeah.
truth. It's like that's just one truth. Focus on the big one.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah. Where'd that come from?
who said that?
No. Where'd that truth come from?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, let's
exactly.
get to the source of that.
Exactly. It's like, here, look, the law of gravity, man. We know it works. Like, okay, my whole life's gonna be about love.
Yeah.
No, dude, it's like that's just one little thing, man. Like there's more going on. So but that should be our next talk. It's like what is belief and how does it can we dissect it? Like and then you'll get the scientist who says, well, belief happens here. And this is what it means in the world of quantum law. It's like your brain vibrates and this all this happening. But man, again, we're just gonna reach a point where you hit like what do they call it, a precipice, where you can't. It's like, well, how do you make that leap? Like, how do you make that quantum leap? It all makes sense up until here, but then it's like, but then you go, how do you jump that thing? And that's all about faith and God and all that. But that should be our next thing, man. Like belief and all that.
Yeah, let's do it because I'd like to study it more because I want to implement it in my own life.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people who like write books on it. It's like, oh man, the whole God thing, that's just to like that was just because we couldn't explain life, but now we know. It's like the power of belief. And so some people take that aim, but then there's like the good, like the positive side of it. But yeah, like the power of belief. I forget who wrote that book. There's this guy named Bruce Lipton. I've been paying a lot of attention to. He's really cool, man. He wrote a book called The Science of Belief, and I was like, that's cool, man. I want to read that book. But anyway, yeah, let's make it the next one. Any last thoughts before we jump off here? I don't need about red wines.
No, I don't have anything.
One good one.
Okay, so sin, affects everybody,
Whether you believe
it or not. Okay, and the good things that can happen in the world can happen to believers and unbelievers. And a person that truly knows God is going to coexist with somebody that is against God in a very respectful and cordial way. Like there doesn't have to be this tension or argument. Like if you don't believe what we're saying,
then die.
Then that's okay. Right? Like that's fine. Because here's the thing. I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's a God and that Jesus is real and that the Bible is our way of knowing his existence, etc.
Yeah.
But I will sit here and tell you that I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And so what I would ask
So don't listen to anything I'm saying.
So what I would ask is that the person that thinks beyond a shadow of a doubt that there isn't a God, to have the same amount of openness to at least humble yourself and say, I could be wrong.
Right, yeah.
You know?
Good. That's good, yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah, I love it. So belief. Next time.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
See ya.